Cool. Hi everyone, I am Akshat Saxena from SBS LabSoc. We are having a session on motion types and burdens. So this topic is basically about what are the different types of motions that you're gonna encounter in debating. Um, what does each motion demand you to do in a particular debate, and how do you fulfill that demand, or how do you fulfill that burden that this particular motion places on you, right? So in our workshops, jitna bhi abhi tak we have talked about motions and we've given you examples of motions in the past workshops, or like the debates that we've sent, or in the documents that we have sent, you might have noticed different types of motions. Some motions would be like this house would ban drugs, or some motion would be like this house believes that apoliticality is immoral and different things. So today we're going to learn what each of those different wordings have, like what are the different burdens that each of those different motions place on you, and how do you fulfill those. Cool. So just a couple of points to note before we get into the types of motions. The first thing to note here is that these are not hard and fast rules. These are only general guidelines which apply to most and not all debates. That is to say that this workshop is based on knowledge that has been shared in the form of guidelines in the debating community in general. So like we'll send you a manual which is used at the world level, which states some guidelines with respect to how you need to go about debating and judging and things like that. So these are just guidelines. In most cases, it's better to follow them, but this does not mean that these are hard and fast rules. There are some exceptional cases where it's fine to not use them, or they are not applicable, or things like that. But in general, in most cases, your rule of thumb needs to be in line with these guidelines, because these are best practices with respect to debating. The second thing here is that these are dynamic and they change over time. So debating as a sport or a community is not something with whose rules are set in stone, right? Even in sports, the rules change. Cricket rules sometimes change कि किस चीज़ पे LBW होता है, किस चीज़ पे नहीं होता है. Football rules sometimes change. So similarly, debating rules or just guidelines in general also change over time. The debating community discusses on rules. Even the pre-existing rules, those are questioned within the debating community, and people discuss whether these rules are fair or not. If if we find after the discourse that a particular rule is unfair, we change that. Or if we find that a rule should be added in the guidelines or things like that, we add that guideline from the next manual onwards, or the next edition of the manual onwards. So these things change over time. As and when they change, we'll update you as long as we're there. After a certain point, when you are settled as debaters, it's your job to keep yourself updated within the debating community, so that your knowledge of guidelines is not out of date, right? So these are just a couple of things that you need to keep in mind, just in general, in the back of your mind, while you absorb all this knowledge with respect to different types of motions. This workshop is not going to be as interactive as the previous one we had. I think last workshop may a lot of people enjoyed, because you got the chance to like have your rebuttals in the chat, and we talked extensively about those rebuttals and things like that. But the reason why this would not be as interactive as that workshop is because this is something that only, like, this is something that you're not familiar with. So this is something that we will be introducing you to, which is why it is more likely going to be a one-way conversation. But in case you have doubts, you can always unmute and write on the chat or things like that. So that, and yeah, I think I took this workshop last year also. Last year it went on for quite a long time, so like we reached close to 3 hours. Hopefully we'll not reach that much this time. I know it sounds scary, but I'll try my best to keep it concise and not waste much of your time. And वही मतलब जल्दी जल्दी निपटा देंगे. Won't rush through it also, but like ठीक ठाक समझा के without wasting any time and things like that. If you have any doubts, feel free to ask. You can also like go over it later on. You can spend time on it so you'll understand better. Cool. So these are the different types of motions. Broadly, three categories. One is policy motions, second is analysis motions, and third is actor motions. Policy motions start with the wordings this house would. This can be like this house would uh, ban drugs. I'm sorry, I use that motion a lot, but that's a pretty simple motion, so that's why. Or maybe like this house would implement universal basic income or things like that. So any motion that starts with the words this house would is a policy motion. Next, we have analysis motions. These are of different wordings. Even within these types, there are further categories. So like there's this house believes that, there's this house supports, this house opposes, this house regrets, this house prefers, and things like that. So an example of a regret motion could be this house regrets the rise of hookup culture. An example of this house believes that motion would be um, this house believes that apoliticality is immoral and things like that. So for every motion, like these are the different types of motions. The third is actor motion. These are motions which you debate not from a neutral perspective, but from a particular entity's perspective. This entity can be a group of individuals or a country or an individual or a social movement. So one motion can be that this house as a minority parent would tell their kid to like teach their kid to uh, push for excellence or something like that. Or uh, as a country also, like this house as the US would invade Zimbabwe, or any kind of motion, right? So in these motions you don't debate from a neutral perspective, you debate as if you are that entity. So if the motion is this house as A will do X, you debate from the perspective of this actor A, what are its interests and what would be good for them and things like that. We'll get into all of these in detail from now on, like in the further slides, but this was just an overview of the broad types of motions. Cool. Let's start with the first type, policy motions. So this is the slide with respect to policy motions. The usual form of a policy motion is this house would do X. Now this X can be anything. So you have two examples on the screen. One is this house would ban drugs. The second is this house would break big tech companies. So big tech, if you know, it's like all these big tech companies like I don't know, Facebook, Amazon, things like that, and they have their businesses within different areas of business, and this debate is basically about whether you should break the big tech and things like that. uh, Basically a debate about monopolies in business and whether like how to deal with them. So these are these are a couple of examples of policy motions. This is what they look like. I just had the examples at the top so you can visualize what this debate would look like. So what you need to do in policy motions is that this policy X, this is generally a policy, and you are debating whether you should implement this policy X or not. Now, what happens a lot of times in debates is that debaters get into whether this policy can be implemented or not. Is it feasible to do this or things like that? They get into it too much. I'm not saying that these should completely be ignored. These can become points in some debates, but in general, the reason why CAs set motions about policies is to have the debaters debate about what are the possible harms and benefits of this policy, whether this policy is a fair one or not by either utilitarian metrics or other metrics and things like that. The debate rarely is intended to be about whether something can be implemented or not. Because if in every debate, in every policy debate, you start questioning the implementation too much to the point that you're forgetting about the normative aspect of this debate as to whether it should be done, but you're only focusing on whether this can be implemented or not, then it won't be much of a meaningful debate. It would be a boring debate and a frustrating debate, right? So these debates are mostly about whether what would be the implications of this policy or whether this policy is a fair one and should you implement it or not. The third thing here is government fiat. Now, what do I mean by fiat, right? Fiat in debating means that the gov team which is proposing a policy has the power to say, like power to assume that this policy would be passed in the parliament, which means that like for any policy that we talk in the real world, for implementation of a policy, what needs to happen is that the legislature of that particular country needs to pass that policy. So the politicians need to have uh, like take legislative decisions, and then only a particular policy is passed for the country or for any territory or things like that, right? So what cannot happen in debates is opposition telling the government that your policy won't be passed in the parliament, or politicians won't pass your policy or things like that. This is not something that opposition teams are allowed to do in a debate. So in a debate, gov teams are allowed to assume that this policy will be passed in the parliament. Now, this doesn't mean that this policy will be implemented perfectly. Opposition teams have the power to question the quality of implementation of this policy as to how efficiently would you be able to implement it. What they cannot question is that this policy will be passed. So implement मतलब pass हो जाएगी policy parliament में for sure. That is something that can never be questioned. Implement भी कर कर लेंगे, बट किस तरीके से इम्प्लीमेंट करेंगे, अच्छे से कर पाएंगे या नहीं, दैट इज समथिंग दैट इज अप टू डिबेट, दैट इज समथिंग दैट द ऑपोजिशन कैन क्वेश्चन, एंड बाय एक्सटेंशन can make a reason that you'll not be able to implement this properly, so you don't get as many benefits as you claim to have, or things like that. So that is allowed, but fiat is something that needs to be respected in debates. It's not allowed for opposition teams to say that government, like legislature, won't pass this policy or parliament won't pass this policy. So that's on government fiat. So the burden on gov, broadly speaking, is basically to provide reasons as to why this policy should be implemented. These can be benefits that a policy provides, or a problem that this policy solves, or like just in general it being a fair policy as compared to status quo or things like that. Conversely, the burden on opposition is to prove that the policy should not be implemented. This can be done by showing that the policy brings more harms than benefits, that the policy would make the status quo worse or the current situation worse, or that the policy is an unfair one for any particular reason. Right? These are the broad burdens. So, how do you fulfill your burdens in a policy motion? Just a second. Cool. So, and this is where we'll talk somewhat about defining the motion also. So, you if you are a government team, you define the motion, you establish a need for the policy by identifying the problem. What do I mean by that? If there's a discussion that is happening about a policy with respect to whether a policy should be implemented or not, most likely this policy is being proposed by someone because they see a particular problem in status quo, and this policy is a way of solving that problem or mitigating that problem or even attempting to solve that problem to some extent, right? So this is basically what government teams are required to identify, that what is the need that this policy fulfills, or what is the problem that this policy attempts to solve. So government teams are required to, like, the best way to fulfill burdens in policy motion is to identify and establish a need for the policy, explain what that need is, why is something a problem in status quo, then you propose a solution, which is your policy with a model. I'll get into definitions and models and everything just soon, just like after I explain the burdens. So the second thing you do is you propose your policy and your model and how you will go about it. And the third thing that you do is prove how the policy solves or significantly reduces the problem that you have identified earlier. So this is basically how you fulfill your burdens as government. So if ever you see a policy motion or a motion of the form this house would, and it's followed by a particular policy, this rough framework is what should come to your mind, that okay, I need to think what problem this policy is trying to solve, and I need to come up with reasons as to how is this policy able to solve those problems or able to some extent mitigate those problems and things like that. So you need to solve, identify those problems, explain them, and analyze in the debate how those problems are better solved on your side. On opposition, they have two options. The first thing that they can do is defend the status quo, which means that if Gov is following policy X, Op can say that we don't want to do anything about this issue. We want to continue as we are right now because policy X will make the world a worse place than what we are living in. What OP needs to do in this case is prove that policy X will make the status quo worse by proving that the harms that this policy brings with itself are more than the benefits that it brings. So the net effect is more harms in Gov as compared to the current state that we're living in, which is what opposition is defending. So therefore, status quo is something that is proven to be better than Gov's world, which makes opposition win the debate. So this is one of the things that opposition can do, that भाई हमको कुछ नहीं करना इस problem का, because what Gov is proposing is a disastrous measure for some reason. You also need to explain the reasons and prove why that policy is such a bad policy that will have implications which make the status quo worse, and therefore you prefer not doing anything as compared to doing policy X. That's one way to go about it if you are opposition. The second way to go about it is propose a counter proposition. This means that if Gov is following policy X as opposition, you can choose to have a different solution to the problem, which can be policy Y. You explain that similar to Gov, and you prove how that solves the problem better than the Gov's policy, right? So this is very common in banning debates. So if the motion is this house would ban drugs or alcohol or anything, Gov would defend a ban. What opposition usually does is that will not sit ऐसे ही in opposition. What we would do is allow drugs or allow alcohol, but we would regulate those things. We would place reasonable restrictions such that these things are still available, but with some restrictions placed on their usage or their sale or their production and things like that. So that is an example of a counter prop proposed by an opposition team. What so the difference between these two approaches is that if opposition if opposition has the first approach, the debate is between policy X on government versus status quo on opposition. Status quo is the current world that we live in. So the debate is between policy X and versus status quo. But if the opposition gives a counter proposition, then the debate no longer remains about policy X versus status quo. Then the debate becomes about which side solves the problem better, whose policy is better. So the debate becomes about policy X on Gov versus policy Y on op. So then the comparative of the debate or the comparison that you're making in the debate changes. So if you are on Gov, you propose a policy, opposition comes up with a counter proposition, then the further speakers of Gov, it would be futile if they continue to compare policy X to status quo, because in LO's speech, opposition has clearly stated that we are coming up with a counter proposition. We also have a different solution to the problem. So from DPM onwards, the comparative has to be policy X on Gov versus policy Y on Op. So the further speakers of Gov have to justify and compare why X is better than Y and not why X is better than the current world that we're living in, which is doing nothing about things or things like that. So that is with respect to opposition. What stance? So opposition can have any one of these stances. What opposition does decides the future course of the debate for both Gov and Op. So three, four things that we need to discuss further here. One thing is a difference between counter propositions and alternatives. This is something that has been an increasing focus with time. So what do I mean by that? A counter proposition, like as opposition, you can either propose counter propositions or you can give a range of alternatives or one alternative or a couple of alternatives without committing to that alternative. So the common thing between counter props and alternatives is that both these things need to be mutually exclusive. What do I mean by that? Mutually exclusive to policy X, which means that anything that Gov is defending, like the policy X, opposition's counterprop or alternative can't have the same policy plus some other things, right? So, um, what do we say? If Gov's policy is, for example, that will not allow people below 18 years of age to have alcohol, ops counter proposition cannot be like, no, no, we are having a different policy. We'll to ban alcohol for people of 21 years or younger, because this still includes part of the policy X that Gov is already defending, which means that these policies are not exclusive to each other. There's a great level of like merging that is happening. So opposition can't have a counter prop that merges with the gov's policy. It has to be completely distinct from the gov's policy. That is what we mean by something being mutually exclusive to something else. दोनों चीजें अलग होनी चाहिए, ठीक है? So what happens in counter props versus alternatives is that if you propose a counter prop, you commit to that counter prop. This changes the comparison in the debate. The debate is now between policy X on Gov versus policy Y on op. So you have to stick to that comparative. What you can do with alternatives is you can say that we prefer status quo. The debate still remains about policy X versus status quo, but you can tell a range of policies that states can use, for example, for solving a particular policy. Probably tell a little about how these things can be used in our world as well without doing policy X. And what happens is you still defend status quo. You don't commit to those alternatives like you do in a counter proposition. In this case, the comparative still remains between policy X and status quo, just that it's not that you're literally doing nothing about the problem. You also can choose a range of policies, or you also have a toolkit of responses that you can have to a certain problem that exists in status quo, but just that you're not committing to any one of them, that यही करेंगे हर केस में, ऐसा नहीं होने वाला. So this is a difference between counter props and alternatives. This is one thing. The next thing that we need to discuss is definitions and models. So what do we mean by a model? Model simply means you as a gov team or even as an op team explaining how you are going to implement the policy. So if the policy is that we will ban drugs, that is a policy X. But what essentially do you do in banning drugs is your model. Do you ban the purchase of drugs? Do you ban the sale of drugs or the production of drugs or consumption? What all you do? So just a few, like just a small level of detail to how this policy is going to be implemented, so that people know what exactly is happening in Gov's world. That is what you mean by a model, or like uh, yeah, so that's what you mean by a model. You don't need to spend too much time on your model, or your debate should not be completely based on your model. The majority of your case should still be arguments as to why this policy is a good policy and things like that. But some level of your case should go on like explaining what the model is. It can be done in a very short time. It can probably be 30 seconds or a minute of your 7 minute speech, but it needs to be there to some extent, right? Another thing is models are only introduced in PM speech. DPM can't add further details to the model that अरे PM में बोला था X और Y करोगे, DPM आके बोल रहे हैं कि हम तो Z भी कर लेंगे मॉडल में. This cannot work. The entirety of your model is something that you need to explain in your PM speech. Similarly, for opposition, if they are proposing a counter model, they have to have that model in their LO speech, and it can't come further in DLO or things like that. So this is about model. What do we mean by defining the motion? This is pretty important, right? Just a sec. So I plan to have a separate slide for this because we realized that this wasn't something that was covered in the previous year's session. But the current core, because they think about your learning, they recognize that this is also something that we should teach or like train you people for. So because I'm pretty busy in other stuff, I could not include a slide formally, but I'm still going to talk about that verbally. So let's talk about definitions or defining the motion, right? So defining the motion means basically defining the key terms in the debate. अब ऐसा नहीं है कि आप हर शब्द explain करने लग जाओ, but in every word, like in every motion, there is at least one word or a couple of words that you need to explain, or if you explain it would lead to a clearer and a better debate. So if the like if the motion is that this house would ban cosmetic surgery or this house would ban drugs, what do you mean by a ban is something that you need to explain as part of defining the motion. Or this house would break big tech companies. How do you plan to break them? It's part of the model also, but you need to define also, like what is big tech and how do you plan, what do you mean by breaking the big tech and things like that. These are things that you need to define. This can be done in a very short time, but it's better if you at least do it in some manner. Now, what are the problems that happen with defining the debate? The problem that happens is people try to win the debate by crafting creative definitions or strategic definitions. So, what is the problem with that? If you define something in a particular way which skews the debate to your favor, that is disadvantageous to the other team and that leads to an unfair debate because you defined something in a manner which is favorable to you, then obviously the job for you becomes easier. Or similarly, if the other team is doing so, the job for them becomes easier. So that should not happen in a debate. The definition should be a fair one, a reasonable one. Both teams should ideally agree that, okay, this is the thing that we're talking about, and then debate what do we do about this thing. That is the fair version of a debate. If a team tries to skew the definition towards their favor and things like that, then that is an unfair debate and that should be avoided. I'll give examples now of what is a fair definition, what is an unfair definition. So specifically in terms of like policy motions, uh, it's so every policy has some average cases and some extreme cases. Majority of the cases that a policy applies to are normal cases and things like that, but there are certain extreme cases where the policy can have different implications. What happens is it's a fair definition from Gov if they want to exclude the extreme cases. So if there are 100% of cases that this policy applies to, they can exclude maybe 5-10% of extreme cases that there are. No, 5-10% cases which are extreme due to some reason. I'll get into examples further. So long as the policy still applies to the majority of cases that was expected in a reasonable debate. What Gov cannot do is make the debate only about extreme cases which are favorable to them and exclude the reasonable normal majority of cases to which the definition or the policy should usually apply to. This is a lot of theory. Let's get into an example, right? You'll understand better through that. So, if the debate is, if the motion is this house would ban cosmetic surgery on Gov, it's a fair definition if they define this ban to be on all cases except, let's say, burn victims or people like that. So a gov can say that we will ban cosmetic surgery for almost everyone, but except this group of people who probably suffer from burn and those are victims of burns, we will allow them to have cosmetic surgery even in our world. That is a minority of cases of cosmetic surgery, right? Everyone doesn't have cosmetic surgery for burns and things like that. Most people, like, they also have cosmetic surgery for to change their features of the face or any other part of their body and things like that. That's the average case, right? The exceptional case or the extreme case here is someone who has suffered a burn and wants to have a cosmetic surgery. A gov would be fair in saying that we will still allow these burn victims to have cosmetic surgery. What we are not okay with is this vast majority of people who get cosmetic surgery for normal reasons and things like that. That is a fair definition from gov, right? What would be an unfair definition? For an unfair definition, let's say, uh, just a second, I'll just think of an example. Uh, Suppose the motion is that this house would have community service as the punishment for criminals instead of prisons. Suppose the motion, like this is a rough motion, I remember it from somewhere, but not the exact wording, but I'll just type out the motion here. Cool. So let's say this is the motion in a debate. This house would use community service as punishment to criminals instead of prisons. So Gov has to defend the use of community service to almost all, like, or a majority of criminals. Op has to defend use of prisons or imprisonment as a punishment for most criminals. What would be an unfair definition in this debate? An unfair definition could be Gov saying that we'll punish criminals by community service, but not all criminals, only young, non-violent criminals. But the reason why this is, and I think you people would also realize that this is an unfair definition. The reason is that this definition vastly reduces the scope of the debate. Because if we're talking about punishment to criminals, presumably we're talking about all sorts of criminals, right? Criminals who are young, criminals who are old, criminals who are violent, criminals who are non-violent, criminals who do crimes out of necessity, like stealing a loaf of bread, or criminals who do crimes out of passion, like murder or things like that, grave crimes or crimes against humanity and things like that. So we're talking about all kinds of criminals here. At this point, the point at which the motion doesn't specify any particular demographic or a group of criminals, Gov can't arbitrarily exclude such a major component of criminals and just say that, oh, we'll only have community service for young non-violent criminals. For rest of the grave crimes wale criminals, we're okay with sending them to prisons. But that is a very unfair restriction to the debate. This is something that, like, defending community service for young non-violent criminals is a relatively easier thing for side government to do. So by defining this motion in such a way, what they have done is skewed the definition or skewed the motion to favor their side in an unfair way, which puts the other side at a disadvantage. This is most probably a definition which will be challenged by the other side, and it would be a valid challenge, and the judge would side with the other side and say, yes, you set up a wrong definition, therefore I was more persuaded by the other side, and things like that. So I hope this discussion on definitions was clear. Uh, the rule of thumb is excluding extreme cases is fine if you have reasons for them. Just making your debate about a very minority of cases or extreme cases is probably something that you should not do. If the if the people who make the motions want to restrict the debate to a certain class of cases, they will do so explicitly. They will word the motion in that way. So if the motion signals to a general level of cases, your arguments or your definition also need to be about that general level of cases. You can't specify that too much, or you can't reduce the scope of the debate too much. That's the rule of thumb for defining the motions well. Cool. So this was about policy motions. So policy models can look like drugs का मैंने बता ही दिया कि what exactly are you banning. For the second example of breaking the big tech, so there are different ways of breaking the big tech. You can either break the big tech by, let's say, if Amazon has multiple parts to itself, Amazon Web Services, Amazon Retail, and things like that, you can probably have all of them being divided into different companies, or you can say that, what's the other way? Wait a second. Hmm, you can just divide the company in general based on like the capital that they have or things like that, just divide its resources or things like that. Or you can say that these are the different categories of this parent company. we'll have we'll break these categories into different individual companies. So there are different ways that you can break the big tech. What you're required to do in a model or even in defining the motion sometimes is tell what exactly do you mean by doing this, and in the model you specify how exactly do you implement the policy. So that's basically it on policy motions. Before we move forward, just taking a break, does anyone have any doubts with respect to policy motions? I'll wait for 30 seconds. Also, these examples that I've given in the chat, these are examples from the world's manual, the manual that I talked about earlier. Yeah, analysis motions favorite. Me too. Uh, these are examples, these same examples are given for explaining definitions in the manual that I was talking about. We'll send the manual to you soon, I guess. You'll get to read that also. So this is not something I'm coming up with myself, although मैं कर सकता हूँ, but manual में जो example है that's pretty clear and easy to explain to you people. So that's why I chose that. Cool. I suppose there are no doubts. In case there are, feel free to unmute. मैं आगे बढ़ रहा हूँ, but I'm open to solving doubts as well. पहले के भी. Cool. Now we're on to analysis motions. So, एक second. Analysis motions are of multiple types, right? So even within analysis motions, there's this house believes that, there's this house supports or opposes, this house regrets, this house prefers. Even within these four types, some of them have further subtypes. So this house believes that may you'll see two types of motions. In this house prefers, you'll see three types of motions, I think. But those are simple. So don't be afraid of how much you need to understand or things like that. This is a theoretical session, which is why it might be seeming like info dump कर रहा हूँ मैं तुम पे, but it's just the first time and you'll get the hang of it in a few days. You'll like naturally you'll तुम्हारा second nature बन जाएगा और habit बन जाएगा that you see this particular type of motion and your brain instantly clicks अच्छा इस motion में I have to do this, and then you'll further think in that particular way. So don't be intimidated by the amount of content that there is. Cool, let's talk about analysis motions. Uh, this house believes that motions, THBT is the short form. This house believes that motions. These are of two types. I'll discuss both one by one. The first type is this house believes that X. Now, X is a statement, it can be anything. So, you have a couple of examples on the screen. One example is this house believes that hustle culture has done more harm than good. Another example is this house believes that it is morally permissible to consume art regardless of the artist's personal background. I would say another example जो मैं पहले repeat करता आ रहा हूँ is this house believes that apoliticality is immoral. So what you would notice in type 1 of this house believes that motions is that these are statements and the teams debate as to whether these statements are true or false, right? These are essentially value judgment debates. You make a value judgment about a particular statement and you judge whether that's true or not, and things like that. So the debates are about truth or falseness of the motion. The debates are not about whether you should do anything about it, right? So you don't need a model because this is a value judgment debate and not a, like, this is just you proving the truth or falseness of a statement. This is not you implementing a policy or things like that. You don't need a model, but you still need to define key terms in the debate. So if the motion is this house believes that hustle culture has done more harm than good, what you don't need to do is have a model or have a policy as to acha we will do XYZ things to solve hustle culture or to get rid of hustle culture. This is not something that you have to do. The motion doesn't ask you to take a particular action. The motion just asks you to argue whether this statement is true or not, whether hustle culture has done more harm than good or not. Harms ज़्यादा है या good ज़्यादा है. This is the only thing that these types of motions demand from teams to do. Uh, Debate whether the statement is true or false. So Gov would prove that yes, hustle culture has done more harm than good because XYZ. Op would say no, hustle culture has done more good than harm because XYZ. So this is the only burden, like in general, this is what how these debates pan out. The burden on Gov is to prove that the statement is true. The burden on Op is to prove that it is false. How do you fulfill burdens in these types of motions? This house believes that X or Y or any statement. Like I said, first step in any motion, not just policy motions, in any motion, the first step is to define the key terms in the debate. Whatever you judge, or like on your own personal judgment, it would get better with time. But you'd recognize that what are the things that if I clarify what this means, or if I just tell the judge what this means, it would lead to a better understanding of my case or my arguments, or just a better or clearer debate in general. You'll get that skill with time, with practice. But yeah, so in any debate, the first thing that you need to do is define the key terms in the debate. What you further do in these types of motions is provide metrics for the value judgment in this debate and then prove that the statement is true by showing how the thing in question meets those metrics. Now this is very complex. Most of you might not know what exactly or know to chodo, but most of you might not be able to imagine what do we mean by metrics here and things like that. So let's discuss examples. Um, This house believes that hustle culture has done more harm than good. Or like, let's discuss the other example. This house believes that apoliticality is immoral. That's probably a better one to understand this. So, what do we mean by apoliticality? Apoliticality means that people do not have a political opinion or don't express that political opinion. People don't go to vote during elections and things like that. They don't protest or they don't upload stories or anything of that sort. So like they basically stay away from politics and they don't get their voices heard in the political process or elections or anything. This is what we mean by apoliticality, right? So if the motion is this house believes that apoliticality is immoral, uh, now, what I'll do is I'll try to tell you how different teams can fulfill burdens in these debates. These and in that process, I'll probably make certain arguments in a short form. Don't focus too much on the arguments or don't think that these are the best arguments in this motion. That is not why I'm telling you those arguments. What I'm doing by doing this is telling you how to fulfill burdens. These are standard arguments or like okayish arguments, decent arguments. You can make them in debates, but that doesn't mean that if you see this motion aage, your argument needs to be the same as what I'm saying right now. It's just a way of me explaining how to fulfill the motion ka burden. So if the motion is this house believes that apoliticality is immoral, then Gov can say that firstly they'll define apoliticality like Abhi I did a couple of minutes ago. Then what they'll say is that panel, we think that any action that uh, leads to harm to other people, or if you're in a position where you expressing your voice can lead to a change in the system which benefits others, but you're withholding your voice or you're not taking that action which leads to harm being perpetuated on someone else, we think any action of such sort is something that is immoral. So you can also define what morality means to you in the debate, but this is what I'm talking about, a metric. So what is the metric here for Gov? The metric can be any action which causes harms to other people or any action which can reduce the harm of other people, but you're not doing that action and things like that. So anything which fulfills this criteria is something that Gov would say is immoral. Now Gov would say that, listen, this is our metric, and then they'll talk about apoliticality and how apoliticality resembles those metrics. They'll say that like many people are apolitical by choice. Like some are apolitical by choice and some are by necessity. Like if you're a laborer or daily wage worker, you're probably not that much involved in politics because you need to think of your day to day and earn your meal. If you're some privileged person who doesn't get affected by politics and your life is going to be the same no matter who comes to power, more or less the same, to the point that you're not affected by politics, that's when you're probably more into the category which is apolitical by choice. Gov can say that, listen, there's a good amount of people who are apolitical by choice, or like even if they talk about all cases, they can talk about all cases. and say that listen, if these people express their political opinion, they can probably vote out this particular political party which is bad, or they should have their voices heard in the democratic process to uphold the value of democracy and things like that. So and all of these things can lead to better policy change or better outcomes politically speaking for a country, which can lead to betterment of citizens and things like that. If you're not doing so, this means that you are becoming a reason in these other people not being able to better their lives. And that is how, if you are being apolitical, that means that you are being immoral. This is the sort of burden fulfillment that is required in these kinds of debates. What did I do here? I defined the key terms in the debate. I gave you a metric by which you should judge whether something is immoral. So, what is the value judgment here? The value judgment here is immorality. Whether I think something is immoral or not, I'm making a value judgment. What is the metric that I'm using to prove or convince you that something is immoral? The metric is that any action which causes harm, or you not doing a particular action which leads to harm, and you doing that action would have led to some benefit to that person, but you're actively not doing that action. If you are doing this, then you are immoral. Now this can mean, this can fit into a multiple this can fit into multiple actions. What the last thing that I do is show how apoliticality is similar to this hypothetical action that I'm talking about. That listen, apoliticality is also something that if you're being political, if you're expressing your opinion in voting, it's possibly something that can help the poor by you voting for better policies or things like that. Possibly good policies get passed because they get don't get passed because they don't get the majority from the public or things like that. So you not expressing your political opinion leads to harm to this other group, and this is how this is this fulfills that metric and meets that metric, and therefore we think that this thing is immoral. This is just an example of how you can go as gov in this motion. What does op need to do in these kinds of debates, right? So what opposition does is firstly again define the key terms. So usually what happens is gov will define the key terms. If it's a reasonable definition, op will uh, op will most likely agree with the definition and start their case. अच्छा ये चीज मुझे definitions में cover करनी थी, I forgot about it. अच्छा याद आ गया. What happens is, what do you do if the other team gives you an unfair definition? If you are opposition and government in PM sets an unfair definition, what you do is right at the start of the LO speech, you start your speech, or you have at least in your speech a challenge to the definition. You say that listen, we are challenging Gov's definition, and these are the reasons why we are challenging it, because it's unfair for so and so reason. And then you continue with your case, which is based on your definition. You tell what the reasonable definition should be, and then you go on with your case. आगे जाके then आगे उस पे और debate हो सकती है, which definition is fairer. The judge will come and explain you which definition convinced them and things like that. But what you do is you launch a definitional challenge. So this is important. If you ever feel that a gov team is skewing the debate too much or defining something unfairly, as opposition, the first thing you need to do, and only in LO speech, you can't do this in DLO or OpWhip or things like that, you have to do it right in the LO speech and pose a definitional challenge and challenge the definition set by Gov and tell why that's unfair. Give your definition which is more reasonable. Why is it more reasonable? And then start your debate. In most cases, it's undesirable to have definitional challenges in the debate because, as you can already imagine, if the teams don't agree on the basic definition of something, then it becomes very difficult to debate about something, because Gov will be going in their arguments as per their definition, Op will be going as per their definition. It becomes difficult for the judges to compare. How do I decide who is winning? Because दोनों अपने अपने हिसाब से चल रहे हैं. That leads to a very parallel debate which is not engaging. So in most cases, it's desirable that you don't have definitional challenges. If your op, try to not have definitional challenges unless really necessary. If your gov, don't set unfair definitions which attract a definitional challenge from opposition. On both sides, as far as possible, avoid definitional challenges, only do them when necessary. Cool, this was about def chals. So as opposition, how do you fulfill your burdens in these kinds of motions? You can do again two things. Now you can uh, provide different metrics for this value judgment and prove how the statement is false according to those new metrics. For example, gov का जो metric मैंने बताया, opposition can probably say that no, this is not a fair metric to judge whether something is moral or immoral. We think that if people have the right to have their own opinion, or like anything in which people are using their rights or things like that, that's probably something that's not immoral. So you have the right to have whatever opinion you want, or like whether you want to engage in the political process or not. So if you're choosing to not engage in political process and be apolitical, that's a choice that you have, and you're entitled, or you are you deserve to get a right to have that choice, and we don't think that that's immoral. Possibly, like, this is something that the opposition can say. What they do here is they challenge the way that Gov is judging whether something is moral or immoral. They provide a different way as to कि नहीं, this is not the only way you should look at immorality. We think you should look at this thing as well. And according to this other metric that we are saying, we think this action of apoliticality is moral. It's not immoral. So this is one thing that you can do. Of course, now if you do this, then Gov will also then attack your metrics by telling how your way of judging whether something is moral or immoral is not perfect or not good, and how our metrics are better and things like that. So you have to be proactive in that as well, telling the judge why the way you judge morality in this debate is better than how the other team is judging morality. You need to win that clash, otherwise the further clash as to whether the statement is true or false is not something that you'll be able to win, right? So that's the thing. The other thing that you can do as opposition is agree with the government on the metrics but disagree on the value judgment made by government. So you can say that, okay, I agree with your way of judging immorality here, or the metric that you use to judge immorality here, but I don't think that apoliticality necessarily leads to that metric being met, or that metric being fulfilled, or that harm being actualized in the debate. This is a way you can break the linking of government by saying that ठीक है, your metrics are fine. We agree that these things in general are immoral, but we don't think that apoliticality is one of those things, or apoliticality causes those problems that you have an issue with. This is also something that opposition can do. If you want to launch an attack on both sides, like doing both first and second approach, like we discussed in previous sessions, you can do it by using even if, like the word even if. So if I have attacks on both lines, I can say first that listen, firstly हम तुम्हारे metric से agree नहीं कर रहे. We think morality should be judged in a different way, which is this is better because XYZ, and we think from this metric of morality, apoliticality is something that is moral, not immoral. But if you have a line of attack on the other side as well, itna बोल के you can say that, okay, even if you don't agree with our metric, let's say कि हम तुम्हारे metric पे बात कर रहे हैं. Even if you don't agree with our metric, let's take your metrics. Even in your metrics, even if we agree with those metrics, we don't think that apoliticality meets those metrics or fulfills those metrics, or like apoliticality is not something a that causes those problems that you are worried about and things like that. So you can launch an attack on both ways. If you do that, use the word even uh, if, or you can just choose to like have one line of attack or one direction of your case. So you can do anything, right? So this was the first type of this house believes that motions. The second type of this house believes that motions are of the form this house believes that A should do X. Now, A can be any entity, it can be a person, an individual, a group of people, a social movement, a company, or a country, anything, right? So, this motion is this house believes that A should do X. So the example can be जो सबसे नीचे ये दे रखा है. This house believes that the US should sanction Saudi Arabia, right? You'll see that this is a different kind of motion from the first one, because in the first motion what we're doing is we are making a value judgment, or we're judging whether the statement is true or not. In the second type of this house believes that motion, this somewhat resembles a policy motion, in the sense that wording is this house believes that, but you're still talking about some action being taken and whether that action should be taken or not, right? So this is more similar to a policy motion. So the debate is still broadly about the truth and falseness, but it's about whether you should do this thing or not. So this debate is about whether the statement is true from a neutral perspective. So if the debate is this house believes that US should sanction Saudi Arabia, you discuss what would be the implications of this, whether that's good for the stakeholders involved or not, and things like that, right? So even though this house believes that motion, you'd notice that this resembles more towards a policy motion. So gov teams are encouraged to implement a model here, even though it's not a this house would motion. But because it talks about an action being taken, the debate becomes clearer and your arguments will land better if you have a model even in this kind of motion, similar to how you have in policy motions. Because if the people or if the judges know that okay, this is how you plan to carry out this action, they get a better idea or an image of what your world looks like, and therefore your arguments become more persuasive, right? So this is what you do in type 2 this house believes that motions. uh, the next type of analysis motions are this house supports X or this house opposes X, right? Now, X can be anything. X can be a person, X can be a group or an institution. X can also be a phenomenon or a cause or an idea. So it can be a tangible thing or an intangible thing. मतलब living, non-living कुछ भी हो सकता है, or a value or a statement, right? The burden is that we should support X either symbolically or politically or materially or in any manner. ये थोड़ा theoretical words हैं. I'll not get too much into that, but the general idea is that you need to find reasons why it's okay to support something or oppose something. On op, the burden is that X should not be supported in any way or in that way. Cool. So the thing to note about these motions is that the teams cannot pick and choose which parts of X to support or oppose. They must support or oppose X in totality, like all of X, all its forms and aspects. They can't pick and choose the things that are favorable to them. The second thing to note is that in supports and opposes motions, there is no fiat. So in policy motions, there is fiat. You're allowed to assume that this policy will be passed in the parliament, right? In supports and opposes motions, you are not given that fiat. You need to prove, like if you are saying that okay, this thing will happen in our world, you need to prove why that thing is likely to happen. You need to provide reasons as to why that's likely to happen, right? I have two examples of motions here. Uh, both will elucidate on the 2 points that I wanted you people to note. So the first example is this house supports universal basic income. So can someone tell what universal basic income is? Either unmuting or on chat, कुछ भी कह दो. Nothing. चलो कोई नहीं. Okay, so universal basic income is basically a policy where the state provides a fixed amount of income periodically to every citizen of its country, no matter whether you have a job or you don't have a job, how rich you are, how poor you are. If a country follows universal basic income, every person in that country would be given some amount of money by the government to sustain themselves or things like that. That's basically what we mean by universal basic income. So the motion is this house supports universal basic income. Now, obviously, this is a controversial debate, right? What you cannot do as government is say that we only support universal basic income for poor people because अरे उनको तो खाना पीना नहीं मिलता है या मुश्किल होती है तो उनके लिए हम करेंगे, but we don't support it for rich people. This is not something that you can do as government. And similarly, opposition can't say that अरे we only oppose UBI for rich people because उनके पास तो पैसा है, but for poor people we allow UBI because ठीक है उनको तो चाहिए. This pick and choosing cannot happen in supports and opposes motions. You need to support and oppose the entire thing. UBI का सीन ये है कि it's given to everyone or it's given to no one obviously है ना, UBI तो है ही. So what Gov needs to defend here specifically is every citizen of the country being given certain amount of money by the state. They can't pick and choose. This is an example that explains the first point. The second point is this house supports US involvement in the Middle East. So this would probably mean how the US tries to solve problems in the Middle East or how it deals with countries or conflicts in the Middle East and things like that. So and any of these motions can be turned to opposes motions. Supports की जगह oppose कर दो, burdens flip हो जाएंगे. गव को जो काम करना था वो op करेगी, op को जो करना पड़ता वो गव करेगी. So this motion is this house supports US involvement in the Middle East. In this debate, the what Gov cannot do is assume the fiat to say that US will only be involved in a non-violent way in the Middle East. That US won't uh, invade countries or US won't launch bombs or things like that. US will only have sanctions and like it will only try to control through trade and influence countries through sanctions and things like that, or diplomacy or things like that. Gov cannot say that this will happen for sure or that we are saying that this will happen. This could be in a policy motion where there was a certain kind of involvement that this policy entailed, but it's a supports motion. So you don't have fiat to say that US involvement will happen in a particular way. What you need to do here is that if you're claiming that US involvement will be non-violent mostly, you need to prove likelihood and you need to provide reasons as to why is it most likely that US will be involved in a non-violent way? Why will they not choose to have violence in the Middle East and things like that? You don't have fiat here. Anything you claim needs to be backed up with proof or with logic or analysis to prove that okay what you're saying is actually likely and not unlikely. तुम हवा में बातें नहीं कर रहे हो, you're saying a realistic thing. So this is a burden that you have in supports and opposes motions. Cool. The third type of analysis motion is a regrets motion. This is a very interesting type of motion. Um, so you can see examples. The first is this house regrets the rise of hookup culture. The second is this house regrets the social expectation of going to university. What are these debates about? Essentially, the debate is about if the motion is this house regrets X, then the world would have been a better place if X did not exist. So this is what this debate entails, and this is what people need to do. They need to compare a world without X to the current world that we live in, which has X, right? This is the comparison in the debate. The second thing here is that teams debate with the benefit of hindsight. What we mean by this is that if you're regretting something, presumably that thing already exists in status quo and has had some impacts in status quo, and that's why you are thinking of acha whether we should regret this or not. Which means that this thing has probably had some impact from past till this point, or is probably likely to have some impact in the coming days as well, which need to be discussed to decide whether something should be regretted or not, right? So this is what we mean by the benefit of hindsight. The third thing is counterfactual is necessary. What do I mean by counterfactual? I talked about two worlds when I started discussing regrets motions. A world without X and a world that is status quo that has X. So the world without X is an imaginary world. This is what we call the counterfactual. You'll use this word a lot in regret motions, or probably sometimes in other debates as well. So it's necessary. What we mean by this is that you can't just talk about the harms and benefits of the thing that you're regretting, that अरे इस चीज के तो ये harms है इसलिए we regret this thing. But that's not the complete line of argumentation. Your case is incomplete if it's just that. To complete that case, in addition to telling those harms, what you also need to do is prove why a world without this thing would not have those harms, or why this world would not have those harms to the same extent, or would have those to a lesser extent, right? This is something that you need to prove, because the burden is about comparing this imaginary world without X to the real world which has X. So the comparison or the debate or the burden isn't complete until and unless you compare these both worlds and prove the world that you are supporting to be better. If you're Gov, you need to prove that the counterfactual would be better than status quo. If you're opposition, you can't just say that अरे हम किसी चीज को regret नहीं करेंगे because this thing has XYZ benefits. That's again not enough for you to do. You also need to think about the world without X, what Gov is portraying that to be. You need to engage with that world and tell why, because of the existence of X, the status quo is better than that imaginary world or that counterfactual where X would not exist, because it would lead to so and so harms which are absent in status quo, और ये benefits जो status quo में हैं वो इस imaginary world में नहीं होंगे because X is not there. So this comparison is something that is extremely like compulsory to do if you want to win the debate. वैसे देखा जाए तो nothing is compulsory in a debate. You can have a shit case and go on with your 7 minute speeches, but the debates are less about what you're allowed to do and more about what is strategically useful for you to do. For you to increase your chances of winning the debate or have a chance at winning the debate, it's almost necessary or important to have the counterfactual ka idea and compare both worlds and tell why the world that you're supporting is better, right? So the last thing is, again, there is no fiat power in counterfactual. You need to debate likelihood. So if the world, like if you're talking about the imaginary world where X does not exist, and you are characterizing that world and telling the panel that this is what this world would look like, you do not have fiat to tell that, okay, this is what will happen for sure in this world. You can't say that. If you're claiming that this is something that will happen in this world, you need to prove the likelihood of why this is likely to happen in that imaginary world, and then only your claims will be understood or like will be credited. So the burden is again on Gov. People have to prove that the world would be a better place if X did not exist by comparing X with status quo. On Op, people have to prove that status quo is better than this imaginary world where X doesn't exist because of so and so reason and things like that. That's the basic burden. So these are a couple of examples. This house regrets the rise of hookup culture. This house regrets the social expectation of going to university and things like that. So you need to assume a world where you need to think of a world where hookup culture was not prevalent, and what would the implications of that be, whether that world would have been a better place or would you prefer the status quo. Similarly, if there was not a societal expectation of going to university, what would that world look like? Possibly less people would go to university and things like that. Possibly corporates would not have a requirement of a university degree as a condition for you to get a job or anything. Like these are things that you need to debate on and need to be proved, but these are just things of imagining the counterfactual, or like ways of imagining what would this other world look like and things like that. So you need to do that in debates, right? How to fulfill burdens in regret motions. अच्छा, okay, fuck, मैं ये पहले ही explain कर चुका without having this slide. Sorry for that. But हाँ वही है, मतलब you can read this all. Like you define the motion as gov, you provide regret metrics. So what are regret metrics? Similar to how you have metrics in a THBT motion. If the motion in the chat was that this house believes that apoliticality is immoral, to prove that something is immoral, you give certain metrics that these are the basis on which we judge immorality. Similarly, in regrets motion, the thing is that this word is set that तुम्हें regret metrics लाना है, because this house believes that नहीं तो कुछ भी हो सकता है. Apoliticality is immoral. You need to provide metrics for what is immoral. Something does more harm than good. You need to provide metrics for what would you see as more harm than good, or things like that. So metrics change depending on what the thing is, and that's true here also. But किस चीज के लिए तुम metric ला रहे हो, that also changes in THBT motions. What happens in regret motions is, in any regret motion you're doing only one thing, you're regretting this particular thing. So in all regret motions, you need to bring regret metrics, which means what are the metrics through which you think that something should be regretted, that if anything fulfills these metrics, this thing should be regretted, and then prove why this particular X fulfills those regret metrics and things like that. So you have your regret metrics, you explain why X is undesirable because it fulfills those regret metrics. Then you describe a world without X, which is your counterfactual, and then you prove how that counterfactual would be better than status quo. On op, you can dispute their regret metrics that no, this is not a reason for you to regret something, or you can again agree with their metrics but say that okay, your metrics are fine, but we don't think that the thing that you're regretting leads to those problems that you're worried about. So we don't need to regret that. And then you describe the counterfactual and then you prove how that counterfactual would be worse than status quo. So this is all about regret motions. Now coming to prefers motions. इसके बाद I'll take a small break for doubts again, and just because काफी info dump हो चुका है, analysis motions में सबसे ज़्यादा types हैं and most complex to deal with. So I'll just take a break after that, just a sec. This house prefers motions. So these are similar to other analysis motions. Um, the thing to note here is that opposition is supposed to defend the specific comparison provided by the motion. We'll get into what we mean by specific comparison, but it's a this house prefers motion, which means you prefer something over something else. In a prefers motion, the binary in the debate, or the things that you're comparing in the debate on both sides, are explicitly and very in a fixed manner set by the motion. So how are they set? We have three types of prefers motions. This house prefer, if the first type is this house prefers X. Now this can be anything. It can be what do we say? Um, एक second यार. I'll just search a motion. एक second. Hmm, I can't find a motion. एक second. Hmm, okay, मेरे को example नहीं मिल रहा है, but I'll use again the manual वाला example as far as I can remember it. So in the manual, the example is that so when you recruit people into the military or into the army, there are different ways of recruiting people. So one is ki the normal recruitment, that people who are interested, they apply for recruitments and then they get selected and things like that. One is conscription, or मतलब basically some countries have this requirement from the citizens that you need to serve in the army for at least 2 years or at least 5 years, and it's compulsory to do so. So that's probably one way. Another way can be probably a lottery or things like that. Ki, okay, these are the people that just by chance or by lottery are supposed to join the army. कुछ भी हो सकता है. So there are different ways of uh, recruiting people into the army, right? If the motion is that this house prefers compulsory like military conscription, which is basically matlab हर कोई has to join the army or serve in the army for at least a certain period, the debate is between that particular method versus status quo. Gaurav, yes, do you have a question?
We can also use the motion of having bonds in medical colleges.
Hmm, I'm not very sure. What do you mean?
Like we have bonds in medical college that we need to serve in rural areas for a particular period of time. We can also use that motion as an example here, can't we?
Not in explaining this concept, but yeah, that is a type of motion that usually crops up in debates as a policy motion or as a this house believes that X should do Y motion. So the way that that crops up is something like this house would like basically that countries would sign bonds with people who are going outside of the country to study on the condition that like government will fund that foreign education, but in return the government wants that you serve in your own country or you are employed in your own country for a particular period of time. So this is a very common debate topic that happens. I think your motion is your idea is specifically restricted to the medical field, but yeah, this general idea of like government funding education or government subsidizing education, but in return expecting something back from the student when they are out is a motion that comes up a lot of times in debates. But yeah, for right now, it's but yeah, what you meant to say was that ये compulsory वाला scene उसमें भी होता है. That's true. But I'm using this military wala to explain what do I mean by the specific comparisons in a this house prefers motion. So if the motion is this house prefers compulsory military conscription और आगे कुछ नहीं दिया है कि prefers this to what कुछ नहीं बताया है, then the assumption by default is prefer this thing as opposed to what happens in status quo. अगर कुछ नहीं दिया है then the other thing is status quo. Now you need to think what happens in status quo. You need to have a fair idea of what usually happens in status quo. Uh, then the comparison in this kind of motion would be that gov needs to defend compulsory like military conscription and op needs to defend whatever happens in status quo. I think it's about like I think what happens in status quo in most places, reasonably speaking, is people who want to join the army they join voluntarily. Uh, those who don't want to join they don't join. That's probably what happens in most cases in status quo. So that would becomes the comparative in the debate. The second type of motion is this house prefers X to Y. इसमें the the people who set the motion have clearly specified what does gov have to defend and what does op have to defend. So this can probably be this house prefers compulsory conscription as opposed to like conscription by lottery or anything. So this can involve any two things and teams have to defend the particular things that they're given to defend. So they have to compare between those two and not necessarily status quo. अब उनमें से कुछ भी status quo में हो सकती है. That's also likely. ऐसा नहीं है कि x और y दोनों ही status quo से अलग ही हैं. Possible that x is status quo or y is status quo. For example, there's this motion about uh, this house prefers holistic education model as opposed to students' choice models. So a holistic education model is one where the education system enforces that you need to study these different subjects and it's compulsory for you to study those. A student choice based model would probably give more freedom to the students in terms of like choosing which subject they want to study and how much they want to study it and things like that. So those are more free in nature. So if the motion is this house prefers holistic education models to let's say student choice based models, the people who have made the motion have defined both what gov has to defend and what op has to defend. It's probably likely that in most cases or in most countries the holistic education model is something that's followed. जैसे इंडिया में you're supposed to study 5 subjects compulsorily till class 10th, right? uh, so that's probably status quo, but it's still x and y two different things. So the comparison has to happen between x and y. So बस वही है जो मोशन बोल रहा है वो उस चीज के बीच में कंपेयर करना है. अगर सिर्फ एक चीज दी हुई है then the other thing has to be what happens in status quo. The third type of prefers motion is if the motion is phrased as this house prefers a world in which X. This is a this is an interesting type of motion because this also involves a counterfactual. Because if you prefer a world जिसमें x चीज हो रही है या x चीज नहीं हो रही है, what you need to do is describe a world with x or without x and defend it, just like you do with a counterfactual in a regret motion, and tell why that imaginary world would be better than the status quo or the current world that we live in. Op has to do the opposite. They also have to describe this world and paint that world as bad or like worse than status quo and eventually prove that, listen, status quo is a better world. We should prefer status quo to this imaginary world. What can be an example of this motion? Uh, एक second. One example can be this. This house prefers a world where organized religion doesn't exist. So, matlab, organized religion is basically this only, that the religions or the religious events are at mass scale. There's like priests there, and there's a set hierarchy in religions, and there are millions of followers and things like that. So is that's how you characterize organized religions. मतलब और भी details डाल सकते हो, मुझे इतना ज़्यादा आइडिया नहीं है. But yeah, this is probably an example. So in this motion, if you're side government, what you do is you describe a world where organized religions would not exist, and then you tell why this world is better than the status quo. Just like you now, another way of doing this could be this house regrets organized religion. The burdens would be the same. As Gov, you have to imagine a different world where organized religion did not exist. Op mein, you have to defend the status quo and say that's better than the imaginary world, that organized religion should exist and things like that. So this is the third type of prefers motion. The exam अच्छा अगली स्लाइड पे एग्जांपल्स थे, सॉरी. मैं काफी सोच रहा था बट ओके. सो हर टाइप के एक एक एग्जांपल्स हैं. दिस इज द फर्स्ट टाइप. दिस हाउस प्रेफर्स एक्स. So this house prefers leaderless social movements. Now सिर्फ एक चीज दी है. What is the other thing that's not given in the motion, so that you have to judge what happens in status quo with social movements. Presumably in current, like in the current world, like in most cases, social movements have a certain hierarchy or a certain group of individuals who is at the top and who is representing the issues or needs or interests of the entire community. Probably that's the structure that most social movements, not all, but most follow in status quo. Then that is something that you need to compare as opposed to leaderless social movements where everyone has an equal say or like there are no leaders, right? So this is an example of the first type of prefers motion. This house prefers X. The second type is one where X and Y both are given to you. This house prefers technocracy to democracy. What we mean by technocracy is that you don't let politicians form policies or make decisions, but you have technocrats or technicians or people who are experts in fields like some environmental scientist or some doctor or those kinds of people. Those are the people who make decisions for the country or for the territory that is being ruled and things like that, or governed, not ruled actually, governed. So this is a clear comparison that is there in the motion, that Gov has to defend technocracy to democracy, why technocracy is better. Op has to say why democracy is better than technocracy and things like that. The third is again, this house prefers a world in which all people have superpowers. Uh, Another important thing to note, also this is an interesting motion, मतलब you'll see mundane motions and काफी heavy motions. You'll also see fun motions at tournaments जिनको debate करने में मतलब you'll require imagination and debate करने में मजा आएगा. Another thing to note about these kinds of motions like this house prefers a world is that there are only two worlds that you need to debate about. There's a world in which all people have superpowers, and there's a world which is status quo where no one has superpowers. No team can create a third world. So if Gov has to defend a world where all people have superpowers. Op can't come and say that, oh, we defend a third world or we prefer a third world where only good people have superpowers. That's again an unfair way of defining the motion. That skews the debate to their side, right? This is why it's you have to be clear that this house prefers a world type of motion. The comparison is between the world that this motion talks about, which is an imaginary world, versus the status quo. You cannot introduce a third world. So that's on this house prefers motions. Cool. We're done with analysis motions, which is the second type of motion. Before we move on to actor motions, does anyone have any doubts? I'll wait for a minute. Gurmeet, Hanji, bolo.
I'm a bit confused with in which type of motions we have to like talk in the totality and just talk in one way, not in the like you're talking about the third world, like there is a presence of something or there is absence of something or it is particularly assigned to something. And the second question which I have is the same thing. Like, can we pick and choose from X and like provide rational and possibility towards the goodness of the humanity, or just support something or oppose something in totality?
Mm, I probably don't understand your question, Pura. Can you reframe or explain again?
I'm
I'm sorry.
asking, like, you have told us two things. Like, we have to oppose or support something in totality. This is
Hmm.
one thing. And the other is we have to, can we provide reasons to, or the possibility or the likelihoods that some part of it will be good for the people and make some skews from it?
Okay, so the part about totality, that was with respect to, like, that was specific to uh, this kind of motion, supports or opposes, right? This is the type of motion where you can't, so anything which you support or oppose exists in different forms in the current world. You can't pick and choose certain forms that are favorable to you and certain forms that are not favorable to you. You have to defend all the forms in which something exists, good or bad. You need to prove why the good is more than the bad, or if you're op and if you're opposing, you need to prove why the bad is more than the good and things like that. So that is there. The totality thing is in this, but there are also motions where, like, uh, मतलब I don't think you can pick and choose in any motion ऐसा. This is like ये चीज explicitly यहाँ बोली है, but probably applies to all motions. But the other thing that you're talking about as to like uh, saying कि ठीक है harms हैं but थोड़े benefits भी हैं, is that what you're trying to hint at?
Yeah.
That's something that you can still do. So even in this motion where you're supposed to defend everything in totality, uh, by that what I do not mean is that if like if the motion is, let's say, this house supports hustle culture, so इसमें गुड चीज ये हो सकती है that hustle culture leads to people working on themselves professionally, helps in like getting them jobs or things like that, career stable होता है. बुरी चीज ये हो सकती है that hustle culture is toxic, creates mental pressure on you, mental stress, or affects your mental health and things like that. By defending something in totality, I don't mean that you start saying that that mental stress is also something that we think is good or things like that. वो आपको नहीं करना है. What you need to do is, okay, we acknowledge that there are bad aspects of hustle culture too, but we think that the good outweighs the bad. That the good effects of hustle culture, which are jobs or things like that, or just people being able to carve out their career better and work towards themselves, that benefit outweighs the bad part. So you can't just deny that, you can't just completely paint something as नॉन प्रॉब्लमेटिक. मतलब ऑब्वियसली आप कोशिश तो करोगे ही, तुम खुद से तो नहीं बोलोगे कि कोई चीज बुरी भी है. But a lot of the times, like there are certain forms. So hustle culture also has certain forms. One form is a motivational form of hustle culture where people work on themselves and you do Coursera courses in your free time instead of watching Netflix and things like that. That's possibly in a positive light because you're working on yourself and you're developing yourself. So that's probably seen in a positive way. But there's also the negative versions of hustle culture where you're, I don't know, working 90 hours a week to the point that you're not able to give time to your family because, oh, you want to gain skills through your job, or like you're taking on mental stress and it's affecting your health and things like that. So, of the same thing, there exist different versions of that in status quo. You cannot in this debate say that अच्छा I तो only defend this motivation वाला version of hustle culture, ये जो toxic वाला है, this is not something that I defend. This is what we mean by defending something in totality. You can't pick and choose. What you need to do is acknowledge that okay, all forms of hustle culture exist, but we think that on balance अगर आप compare करो तो अच्छी चीजें जो हैं या अच्छे forms जो हैं या उनका जो impact है, that's better than the bad versions of hustle culture, or just in general like do that comparative analysis of why harms outweigh benefits or benefits outweigh harms. So does that make it clear?
Yeah, very clear.
Okay, okay, thank you. सहज हाँ बोल.
Just to add to this, and like I think Akshat pretty much explained everything, but just to put it in a different word also. So simply put, your aim is कि आपका world, whatever you're defending or opposing, in totality, the outcomes of that world, or that world being accrued and happening, uski values and uske value net benefits should outweigh the harms of it. As long as you're able to do that, by possibly picking and choosing, but possibly net totality दिखा के कि आपका outcome is going to be good, that should be your aim. But of course, I think Akshat covered कि you can't really pick and choose कि only this part, not that part, and that's exactly what we call trade-offs, right? You'll have to take trade-off कि ये net negative आएगा, but we still think the positives outweigh these negatives, and in totality we achieve a greater outcome. तो वो अगर आप अपने स्टेक होल्डर्स को बता सकते हो कि overall it will be a better world, that is your aim as a team basically. So that's where the pick and choose aspect does come about.
True, true. So like even in other kinds of motions in general, you can pick and choose, or you can try to show that अरे ये version is the dominant version of something, and बाकी जो गलत version मतलब गंदे versions तुम बोल रहे हो वो इतना exist नहीं करते. But वही है, you can do that. That's a strategy. But like Sahaj said पहले वाले workshops में भी, the best strategy is to be charitable to the other teams. So when you acknowledge that yes, there are faults in my world as well, but you still prove that benefits outweigh harms, that makes your case solid because you're assuming your worst case scenario and conversely दूसरी side का best case scenario and still proving why your world is better कि ठीक है खराब है but still अच्छा है, तुमसे तो अच्छा ही है kind of वैसा. So that's the strongest strategy. Gaurav, you had a doubt. You can
Yes, I need to ask one question here. That in this session, two words are specifically used. That one is metrics and the other is fiat. So can you explain in a short manner what fiat generally is? Metrics, I got a specific idea, but what fiat is generally does generally mean?
okay. So fiat basically means the assumption in debating. Do you need to add something?
No, no, no. It's
Acha,
just
okay.
that question.
So if we say that Gov has fiat to claim something, what it means is that Gov can assume that that something would happen in their world. So if Gov has fiat to assume that the policy will pass, like Gov has fiat to implement that policy, what you need to assume is Gov is capable of getting that policy passed in the parliament and capable of implementing that to some extent. Now अब वो कैसा implement होता है, किस मतलब what is the quality of implementation, are you like do you like high end implementation, are you able to achieve that, or is it in a subpar manner? That's something that's up to debate. But what you can't do is question gov by saying that array this is to a policy which doesn't have support, people will not pass it in the legislature only, ऐसा नहीं है. You need to assume that this policy will be passed and then discuss the implications of that policy and debate on whether you should uh, have that policy implemented or not. So that's what we mean by fiat. Does that clear it?
Yes, it does. Fiat is fiat only used in policy making debates, or is it used in other debates as well?
So fiat is used in policy debates. It's also sometimes used to some extent in actor debates. I'll get into that when I explain actor motions, which is the last part of this workshop. But yeah, mainly in policy debates, to some level in actor debates as well. I'll get there is a difference in fiat there. I'll get into that then.
Fine, fine.
Cool. Any other doubts by someone? Cool. I'm assuming there are no doubts. I'll move on to the last part of this workshop, and then some final thoughts on motion types and burdens. Cool. So the third type of motion is actor motion. Actor is basically a particular entity or a stakeholder in a debate. So इससे पिछले वाले जितने भी motions थे, what you might have noticed is हम debates एक neutral perspective से ही कर रहे हैं. There are different groups that are benefited and different groups that are harmed in a particular debate. We take into consideration all of those harms and benefits and उस हिसाब से describe which world is on net a better world. Or like if there are different groups, like किसी चीज से एक ग्रुप को हार्म होगा बट दूसरे को बेनिफिट होगा. In the debate, in a neutral perspective debate, which is all the motions before this, you are supposed to support your group in comparison to the other group कि यार अच्छा इन दोनों को harm और benefit होगा but we think this group is more important than the other group. You need to provide justification as to why you're preferring the impact on one group over the other group and things like that, right? Uh, so those debates happen from a neutral perspective. You take all implications into account. You give due importance to every implication जितना वो implication deserve करती है. इसका ये मतलब नहीं आप हर चीज को equal weightage दोगे. That's still something that you need to define, like tell the judge, because हमने दूसरी वर्कशॉप में डिस्कस किया था स्ट्रक्चर ऑफ एन आर्ग्यूमेंट में that to any argument there is two things, there's truth and there's relevance. So every impact might be true, but how relevant is it in a debate is something that you need to explain. Some things might be more relevant, some things might be less relevant, but कुछ तो relevance होगा. So what I mean by due importance is that from a neutral perspective, in the neutral perspective debates, everything will receive the amount of importance it objectively deserves in that particular debate from a neutral perspective. But what happens in actor motions is that the debate happens from the actor's perspective. So this actor is possibly an entity. It can be this house as the United States, or this house as Bernie Sanders, or this house as the feminist movement. It can be anything, right? So the actor can be anyone, group of people, individual, country, company. You can say this house as Bill Gates, or this house as Reliance, or anything, right? So this actor can be any entity. So the debate happens from the actor's perspective. This is the difference between actor motions and all other types of motions. अभी तक हम neutral point of view से कर रहे थे, but now we don't need to think about what is important to the world in general, or what should be important, but what is important to the actor. Now there are impacts which we would usually care about, but a certain person would only, because a certain person would have certain priorities and certain things that they pay importance to and certain things that they don't pay importance to. We need to get into the head of that actor and think that okay, what are the things that they would prioritize, and make your arguments according to what best fulfills those priorities. That's the difference between actor motions and all other types of motions. So you assume that you are this actor, and then you think, acha, would this motion be a good thing or a bad thing from this actor's perspective, yeah, from my perspective, if I am the actor, and therefore you debate accordingly. So these are the couple of examples that we have. One example is this house as US would invade Zimbabwe. The second example is as a parent from a minority community, this house would teach their children to pursue a mediocre but satisfactory and happy life over a life which involves a constant pursuit of excellence and the extraordinary. So, uh, अब इन दोनों डिबेट्स में ही है. लेट्स डिस्कस द फर्स्ट मोशन, माइनॉरिटी कम्युनिटी वाला. From a neutral perspective, people can debate that okay, what is good for a minority child? Should they settle for like a decentish job or a mediocre life where they're stable and they're happy and things like that? Or should they pursue excellence कि यार मेरे को top college में जाना है, मेरे को top job चाहिए and things like that? What should they do? From a neutral perspective, that would be a different conversation. But because the motion says as a parent from a minority community, you need to get into the shoes of this particular parent and you need to think what would be the priorities of this parent, and therefore which kind of upbringing for my child would meet those priorities. So Gov can possibly say that, yeah, we are from a minority community, which is like minority communities are mostly underprivileged and find it more difficult to excel in this world because of lack of privilege and things like that. So a minority community का parent would probably have the view that अरे यार मेरे बच्चे को मुझे ज़्यादा I don't want them to break their back over things or take stress because anyway excelling is difficult in this world for minority community. I'd rather have them pursue a mediocre life where they have less stress and they are happy and things like that. So if this is the priority of a parent from a minority community, this means that okay, they would prefer their child to have a mediocre life over a life of excellence, even though objectively a life of excellence might be better for this child. This is the difference of point of view that I'm talking about. Objectively कुछ भी हो सकता है. Maybe this life of excellence is actually better for the child. But when you're doing an actor motion, you need to think what the parent thinks is best for the child. Like that's in interest of the parent, that the parent wants their child to be happy and things like that. Which side of the motion would best cater to that interest कि यार मेरे को अपने बच्चे को ज़्यादा स्ट्रेस में नहीं रखना है, खुश रखना है एंड ठीक ठाक सर्वाइवल हो जाए, मतलब बैंक बैलेंस ठीक ठाक रहे टू द पॉइंट दैट इमरजेंसी हो जाए वो अपने बच्चे को स्कूल भेज सके, बट ज़्यादा कुछ भयंकर पैसा वैसा नहीं चाहिए. इफ दैट इज अ इंटरेस्ट और दैट इज द बिलीफ ऑफ अ पेरेंट, which side of the motion caters to that more? It's the gov side, which talks about a life of mediocrity. Conversely, the opposition can probably say that as a minority community, it's important for you to like, um, I don't know, बच्चे का ambition, like every kid has some ambitions, right? They don't want to be restricted to this mediocre life, and if if they are able to prove that the parent of this minority community is more likely to have a belief that, yeah, I'm anyway from minority community. I don't want my kid to end up in a mediocre place, or like I want my kid to fulfill ambitions or push limits, etc., etc., because probably mediocre life उनके लिए वैसे ही अच्छी नहीं होगी or things like that. If they're able to prove that interest, then probably they'll be able to prove why a life of excellence is better than a mediocre life, even though objectively someone might think that a mediocre life is better. So this is the difference of point of views that I'm talking about. I hope that's clear, right? Similarly, in the second motion, if we're talking about this house as US would invade Zimbabwe. Now, US invading Zimbabwe would probably be a violent thing. It's possible that US will use violence over Zimbabwe and like some involvement of military will be there and things like that. So, इसके real world impacts मतलब from a neutral perspective ठीक है, people in Zimbabwe might die due to bombings. Okay, fuck, sorry, यहाँ पे spelling गलत है. Zimbabwe. हाँ, from a neutral perspective, it's probably likely that some casualties would be there and people are likely to lose lives in this invasion due to this US ka invasion, and it would lead to loss of life and property and things like that. As a neutral person, you would care about this impact, but in an actor motion, opposition can't just say this कि अरे यार लोग मरेंगे therefore US should not invade. What they need to prove is why does US care about this loss of life and property or things like that if it is happening, and therefore say that it's not in the best interests of US to invade Zimbabwe because this is the reason why the US does not want loss of life and property. This reason can be anything. It can be their image that they want to uphold, or like the negative or the backlash that they'll get from the international community or anything. Uh, Again, not saying that these are perfect arguments, these are just things that I am thinking of how you can fulfill your burdens. So in active motions, you like thinking from the neutral perspective is not enough and not something that you strategically do. What you do is you think from the perspective of the actor what best serves their beliefs, their priorities, and their interests, and therefore make your arguments according to that. So the debate happens from the actor's perspectives. You need to consider what A's knowledge is, what A's values are, what A's interests are, and whether this motion is in the actor's best interests. The debates are not about whether the action is necessarily best for the world. Something might be very bad for the world, but as an actor, I would possibly still want that thing. So my perspective can be different from the neutral debater or judge wala perspective. The fourth thing, this is where it gets tricky. People think that self interest की बात है and every actor would think about their own self interest or what benefits them. This means that आप morality पे arguments नहीं बना सकते कि यार we should oppose something because it's unfair. This is not an argument that you can make in actor motion. But that's not completely true. Uh, you can still make arguments about fairness of certain things, provided that you prove that this actor cares about those moral beliefs. What do I mean by this, right? A lot of the times, actor motions are about self interest of the actor and which side of the motion caters to that self interest best. But realistically speaking, I don't think everyone is solely everyone solely prioritizes their self interest. Like, if you look at yourselves or you think about yourselves, you'll not always prioritize self interest. You also have certain moral beliefs in mind. The fact that you don't want to steal someone's money, or the fact that if you see someone in distress, you want to help them even though it might not be in your self interest. So there are moral beliefs that every actor or most actors hold, and it's not just about self interest. The thing is, people make those arguments, novice teams or fresher teams make those arguments, but they don't do the linking as to why this moral belief is something that the actor cares about. That linking is absent, and therefore it becomes an argument from a neutral perspective that, Are, you, you should not do this because this thing is unfair. The other team is like, okay, it's unfair, but how does the actor care about that fairness or unfairness? ये तो तुमने explain किया ही नहीं. At that point, it's just a neutral argument and not a relevant argument in this debate. So what you need to do is, if you're running a moral argument in an actor motion, you need to provide reason as to why this actor is likely to hold that moral belief, and therefore they would want to fulfill that moral belief, or even if it's against their self-interest, they would want to uphold that moral belief and do the right thing and be fair, things like that, right? So wahi hai. So the burden on gov is to prove that action is in the actor's best interest. Opposition pe hai ki it's not on the best interests. How do you fulfill those burdens in the actor motion? What gov has to do is again define the motion. This is common for all motions. For actor motions, you describe what the actor's interests, values, and things like that are. You give reasons as to why is this actor likely to prioritize one thing over the other. Then you show how the motion or the action being talked about is in the best interests of the actor. So first part में आपने बता दिया कि oh, the parent probably has a priority to keep their child stress free and things like that, even if they don't succeed excessively in life. This is something that is parent ka interest, that they don't want their child to be too much in stress. How does the action or the motion serve those interests? Well, if you live a life of mediocrity, you make enough money to cover all your expenses, but at the same time you have less workload or you don't have a demand for excellence. Whereas on the other hand, you might make a lot of money, but your life would be too stressful, and in most cases you probably won't be able to reach that level of excellence because you don't have the privilege needed to do so. Now, as a parent who wants their child to not be as to not be stressed 24/7 and feel unworthy or question their own self-worth, you probably want your child to live a mediocre life over a life of excellence. So this is how you link the action to the interest of the actor. That you explain what are the implications of both courses of action, then you tell why one course of action is better to fulfill the actor ka self-interest, or the actor's interest in general. That's how you do on Gov. On opposition, you can do two things. One is you disagree with the characterization of the actor from Gov. So Gov can say parent wants stress free, the child to be stress free. Op can say that no, parent wants their child to push the limits as a minority person because their community has not been able to do so in the past, and they want their child to break those ceilings, or those glass ceilings and things like that. And they also want their child to have the best life or the highest excellence in life possible and things like that. They might have reasons to prove that, and then they say that अरे नहीं, life of excellence is better than life of mediocrity because ये interest excellence वाली life में ही fulfill हो पाएंगे. This is one way that opposition can go about it, right? By disagreeing with the interests of the actor as a whole, कि यार तुमने पेरेंट्स के इंटरेस्ट ही गलत बताए हैं, हम आके बताते हैं कि what parents actually prioritize, and therefore according to this we think our side of the motion caters better to those interests. Now, like I said in an earlier motion type, if you question the interests, this will also lead to a sub debate within that of which side proves the interests of the actor better. If the interests are different, if the side doesn't prove that, if both sides don't agree that parents के ये interests हैं या ये priorities हैं, then the one clash becomes which side proves their priorities better, and according to that further clashes follow. That if judge thinks that अरे gov side was more persuasive in telling that parents के priorities are these and not those, then the further arguments would be judged based on these priorities and not those priorities. So this becomes an important clash in those cases. The second thing that you can do is agree with gov's interests but argue that action or the motion doesn't meet those interests. So a gov team can probably say, sorry, an op team can probably say to a gov that listen, we agree that parents want the life of their child to be less stressful and things like that, but you don't achieve that less stressful life as a parent in gov as well. Why is that likely to happen? Because this minority kid, when they grow up and they don't pursue a life of excellence and they pursue a life of mediocrity, probably they'll feel that they'll not feel enough of themselves, or like it will affect their self-worth, and like कि यार these other people reach high positions or in their jobs or things like that, but I'm doing this subpar job just survives me. Or forget about that later stage, even within the pursuit of excellence, it's possible that your child has ambitions of reaching that level of excellence, but because you want your child to live a safe life and things like that, you're pushing them down and you're forcing them to live this life of mediocrity. Probably that is also something that will cause your child stress. And therefore, we agree that parents want their child to not be stressed, but your course of action causes stress to the child, while our course of action probably will let the child fulfill their ambitions and make them like have the best life that they can possibly have and things like that. So this is also another strategy that opposition can use. You agree with the interests of the actor, but you disagree with the fulfillment of those interests, and you say that okay, we agree with this, but we think these interests are better fulfilled on our side, right? अगर आप दोनों lines of attack use कर रहे हो, again use an even if. You disagree with gov's interests and say that okay, we think the parent has different interests, and you prove why your side caters to those interests. But then you say even if you don't agree with our characterization of parents के interests क्या हैं, even if we debate on your interests, we think even in that case you also don't achieve your own interests. So आप बता रहे हो कि parents have these priorities. So you can use even if you're using both lines of attack, it's fair for you to use just one line of attack as well, depending on what kind of case you can create. Cool. Uh, this is the last slide. We're done with motion types and burdens. Just a couple of notes in general. A lot of the times people get confused between these two types of motions. This house believes that X should do Y, and the second is an actor motion. This house as X should do Y. The difference in these motions is in the first motion, um, it's a neutral perspective motion. It's not from the perspective of the US. So any harms of invasion or implications in general of invasion, they need to be evaluated from a neutral perspective. Whereas in the second motion, you adopt the perspective of US. What are the priorities of US? What serves US interest best? and therefore you debate the motion on those grounds. Before that, there was a question about fiat कि policy motions के अलावा किस में होता है. So fiat is also there in actor motions to a certain extent. Why is that so? Because most actor motions, not all again, most actor motions are of the form this house as someone would do something. So the word would is still coming here. Would means that they are taking an action. But here it's not a neutral perspective motion, because in a normal policy motion, usually it's the state that's passing a policy, right? If you're banning drugs, it's most likely that the state would ban drugs. और तो कौन ही बैन करेगा, because वही कर सकते हैं ना. So in most policy debates, it's the state that passes or implements a policy. But in actor motions, as we have realized, the actor is not always the state. The actor can be an individual, the actor can be a social movement, it can be a company or a business person or anything. Which means that all of these don't have capability to implement something equal to the state. The state can implement things to a large scale, an individual can probably not implement that to such a large scale, because they are only an individual, they are probably a cog in the machine, or like they don't have enough resources or capital or social capital to implement such a large scale policy, obviously, right? An individual can only do so much, they can't do everything that a state does and things like that. So depending on the actor, the amount of fiat that you have also differs in actor motion. If it's an individual, you need to realize that an individual has a very minute amount of power. Now this can depend. If it's a business person, more power. If it's an underprivileged individual, less power. That's up to debate. But definitely in terms as compared to policy motions, the fiat is not equal. The fiat is definitely less here. If you're talking about an individual or a small group of people or even a social movement, right? Social movements like feminist movement or the LGBT plus movement, these are movements which have limited resources and they need to optimize those resources best to fulfill their priorities, right? So these also cannot take actions as freely or as efficiently as a state can, or on a scale, on a large scale that a state can. So fiat is there in actor motions as well, but you need to be mindful of how much fiat do you assume. You do try to not be unreasonable that अरे individual है but बहुत ज़्यादा कुछ बड़ा सा कर देगा. You probably need to rethink that whether that individual is capable of doing something that big or not, right? So that's on fiat. The last thing here is that this list of types is not exhaustive. Again, like I said, these are just guidelines and not rules. And uh, मोशन टाइप्स, यूजुअली दीज आर द मोशन टाइप्स दैट यू विल सी जो हमने अभी तक डिस्कस किए पिछले 2 घंटे में. But there are other motion types as well that might come up sometimes or the other. So any kind of motion can come up. There are a couple of examples on the screen. This house fears the rise of China. अब तुम बोलोगे कि यार अक्षत ने तो fears नाम का कोई मोशन सिखाया ही नहीं, हम इसमें क्या करें. What you need to do is you need to use your brain. Be calm, don't panic, just use your brain. Remember क्या क्या types of motions हमने समझाए थे. There is policy motion which is a clear motion, this house would. So policy motion में सिर्फ would ही आता है. The third type of motion is actor motion, this house as someone would do something. This motion is neither a policy motion nor an actor motion. बचा क्या, which is the second type, analysis motion. So you've narrowed down that okay, ये word मैंने कहीं नहीं देखा है, but this is an analysis motion. So then you think of burdens. Okay, this is an analysis motion, just like you do a regret motion. You have regret metrics and things like that. Here, the value judgment that you're making is fear. What is something that you need to fear? What metric does something need to meet for it to be worthy of being feared? Then you think of your case in that direction. You develop metrics for okay, when should something be feared? Possibly, if a country gains too much economic or political or military control or development, that's possibly a situation where you should fear that country. And then you'll say how China has been having that level of development in all aspects, and therefore you prove that okay, this is why we think we should fear China. Op would do the opposite, obviously, right? So this is how you do motion. So another type of motion would be this house celebrates hookup culture, possibly. So celebrates is a word that's opposite to regret. So उसमें burden swap हो जाते हैं. So these are types which are not covered in the manual or not covered formally in briefings, but these can come up as debate motions. So what you need to do is you need to be calm and you need to apply the burdens, figure out कि इसमें क्या करना है and accordingly think. The second type of motion, which is kind of a mix of two different types of motions, is this house as US regrets Japan's remilitarization efforts. Hanji. So this second motion is an actor motion, but it's also a regrets motion. So it's a combination of two different types of motions. What do you do in this case? You firstly you need to realize that दोनों टाइप के मोशंस आ रहे हैं, सो दोनों टाइप के बर्डन्स मिक्स हो जाएंगे एंड दोनों फुलफिल करने पड़ेंगे. What you do is you regret this motion or regret Japan's remilitarization efforts. You think of why a world without Japan putting those efforts would be a better world than status quo, but you do that from the US का perspective. That if in an imaginary world जहाँ पे जापान ये efforts नहीं डालता, why would that world be better for the US than the status quo जहाँ पे जापान वो efforts डाल रहा है remilitarize करने के खुद को, developing weapons and all that. So you need to think of the counterfactual and evaluate counterfactual versus status quo, but from the perspective of what is good for the US as opposed to what is good in general. ठीक है? This is how you do motions where there are more than one types involved. So yep, these are just acknowledgements and credits. Like I said, there's a words manual that exists where there are a lot of guidelines. This workshop is majorly based on uh, those guidelines and also a couple of other debating guides that I read somewhat. जिसके नाम मैंने mention नहीं किया, but those are there. I'll send them to you also if you want. Cool. So I think we've come to the end of the session. I'll just stop recording now. It's been 2 hours exactly, I think, since the session started. 2 hours, 5 minutes or something. So, ठीक है.